Bottom of the ninth, 2 outs, bases loaded, down by 3. A scenario many of us have played through our minds in the backyard, but if it really were to happen, who would you want at the plate? Who can handle this kind of pressure? Who can slow down the game and deliver when it matters the most? Who is clutch enough to handle this situation? Is there even a correct answer to this question? Is there a clutchest hitter of all time? You can find countless articles and lists online trying to answer this very question. Most of them have similar names: David Ortiz, Derek Jeter, Kirk Gibson, Joe Carter, David Freese, and so on. But what if I told you that none of those players is actually the clutch king? What if it's someone that we've never considered? Being clutch is not an easy thing to quantify, and it's not an easy thing to calculate, but there has to be someone out there who can be crowned the clutch king. By the way, only 3% of you watching this video are subscribed, so if you enjoy the video, I would really appreciate it. It's completely free, and you can always unsubscribe at any time. Let's start by defining clutch. I think most people would throw out a definition like a player playing well when the game is on the line, or something along the lines of that. To get a more formal definition though, we need to define when the game is on the line. This isn't a yes or no question. The game being on the line isn't really a binary value. There's a whole spectrum. A moment in a game could be pretty meaningless, it could completely decide the game, or it could be anywhere in between. We know that a 1-run lead in the top of the 9th inning is a lot more tense than a 1-run lead in the bottom of the 5th, but even less tense than that is a 1-run lead in the 1st inning, and there are many other possible scenarios in between. But how do we decide where to place it? That is where the term leverage comes in. Leverage meaning how impactful the situation is to the overall outcome of a game. The leverage of a moment is placed along this scale using what is known as the leverage index. To calculate this leverage index for a given moment, you need to look at all the possible swings and win probability that are possible. Say Team 1 has a 75% chance to win going into this at-bat. If the player hitting gets a hit, then it goes to 85%. If the player hitting gets an out, then it goes down to 70%. Though if he hits a home run, then their chances go all the way up to 95%. In a real example, this calculation would be a lot more in-depth, but this will give you the general idea. These outcomes aren't equally likely, so we weight them based on their chances of occurring. For example's sake, we'll say that there's a 25% chance to get a hit, a 5% chance to get a home run, and a 70% chance to get an out. We multiply these numbers together, then take the sum. This is the average win probability swing for this moment in the game. In order to normalize this to the leverage index, we then divide it by the average leverage for a given moment, which in this case we'll set to 0.04. That makes the leverage index of this at-bat 1.75. Anything below 0.85 is considered low leverage, anything between 0.85 and 2 is considered medium leverage, and anything above 2 is considered to be high leverage. For our made-up example here, we would be in the upper range of medium leverage. To further grasp this idea, let's go look at Game 2 of the NLDS between the Mets and Phillies. This was a tense game, especially towards the end, so we should expect to see some high numbers when it comes to the leverage index. Let's jump in the bottom of the 8th inning. The Mets are winning 4-3 with the Phillies coming to bat. The Phillies have a 30.4% win probability going into the inning. Trey Turner leads off the inning with a strikeout. The leverage index of this at-bat was 2.48, which is considered high, and almost 2.5 times the leverage of an average situation. This makes sense since the tying run is at the plate with no outs in the bottom of the 8th inning. After this out, the Phillies' win probability drops to 24.1%. Bryce Harper then comes to the plate, but the leverage has now decreased to 1.85. Since there's one out now, the win probability swings are going to have less magnitude. Harper ends up walking, raising the Phillies' chances back up to 31.1% with the tying run now on base. Now it's Nick Castellanos, and the leverage index has shot all the way up to 3.34, the highest leverage index the game has seen. Castellanos singles to right field, moving Harper, the tying run, to third with only one out. The win probability now shoots up to 49% for the Phillies. Bryson Stott now steps to the plate. The leverage index, all the way up at 5.18, an insanely high number, as a strikeout here could really kill the Phillies' rally, but a hit or a sac fly could tie the game, and an extra base hit could give them the lead. Of course, Stott ends up hitting a triple, causing both runners to score, and the Phillies' win probability going all the way up to 90.4%, a jump of 41.4. That swing was huge for the game, hence the incredibly high leverage index. The The Phillies ended up winning that game 7-6, and going back and looking at the game as a whole, Bryson Stott's at-bat had the highest leverage index, and most people would agree that it was the most important at-bat of the game. In this case, Stott would be considered clutch as he performed extremely well in a high leverage situation. So, who around the league is the best in these kinds of scenarios? In 2024, the top hitter in high leverage situations was Jurickson Profar. He had an impressive 324 WRC+ while hitting in a scenario with a leverage index of at least 2. This means he was over 200% better than the league average hitter. The rest of the top 10 can be seen here. You can see that Profar has a very sizable lead above the rest of the league. So these were the best hitters in high leverage situations in 2024, but what about the worst? The worst hitter was Maikel Garcia with a WRC+ of -27, 127% worse than the league average hitter. The rest of the top 10 is right here, and maybe one surprise entry is Bryce Harper, considering he was one of the better hitters overall in 2024. His overall WRC+ was 145, which was one of the better marks in the league. In high leverage scenarios though, he just couldn't seem to produce at the plate. Him being on this end of the list is a lot more surprising than a guy like Andrew Vaughn, who was one of the worst hitters overall in 2024. We can control for this difference by using a stat aptly named Clutch. Clutch takes a player's performance in high leverage and compares it to how they hit on average in a context-neutral environment. If a player has a clutch of 0, then they perform the same in high leverage situations as they would in any other situation. The clutchest hitters in 2024, according to Clutch, were the following. Brandon Nimmo now holds the top spot with a clutch value of 2.61. He saw the most improvement in high leverage situations. Jurickson Profar is still here, but he no longer holds his top spot. Now, going to the other end of the spectrum, the least clutch hitters, with the worst being Colton Cowser with a value of -3.12. As you can see, there are a lot more productive hitters on this list than the previous one using just high leverage stats. There are guys here that hit pretty well on average, so if they start to slip in high leverage situations, then they're gonna be punished more by it. So I guess we now know who the clutchest hitter in the league today is, right? Well, not necessarily. There's one glaring flaw in this list that prevents us from drawing any significant conclusions, and that is the sample size. Let's take these lists and add the number of plate appearances each player had in high leverage. As you can see, these samples are drastically small. In fact, the player with the most high leverage plate appearances in 2024 was Jeremy Pena with 76. 76 plate appearances isn't even a full 20 games worth. So if we're going to try to pick the clutchest player of 2024 with these stats, that would be like trying to pick the MVP of the season after just 15 games. That wouldn't make much sense. On average, only 10 to 20% of players' plate appearances are high leverage, meaning it would take at most 10 seasons worth of plate appearances to get a full season's worth of high leverage plate appearances. Keep that in mind going forward. The next logical step in defining the clutch king is to go away from looking at the single season numbers and begin to look at hitters' entire careers. First, let's expand our search to players since 2000. There are 349 different hitters who've had at least 4,000 plate appearances in that time span. Let's plot them on this graph based on how clutch they were and how many plate appearances they took to get there. The clutchest player since 2000 has been Ichiro Suzuki with a value of 8.28, the highest clutch value out of any of these qualified players. The lowest value is Marcus Semien, who's right here with a value of -10.46. If you've been following along closely, you might notice that there's something that doesn't seem right with this graph. What we would expect to see is a trend like this, where the clutch players accrue more clutch in the positive direction and the non-clutch players accrue less clutch in the negative direction. This clutch stat is a counting stat. It doesn't account for the number of plate appearances like a stat like batting average does. We don't see that trend though. So instead of just looking at the pure clutch stat, let's instead look at clutch per plate appearance. The first thing that you might notice is that Ichiro is no longer holding the top spot. The new top dog is right here, and that player is D. Strange Gordon. This is a little more surprising as D. Gordon, even in his prime, wasn't really known for his hitting, let alone his clutch hitting. But on a per plate appearance basis, he's been the most clutch hitter since 2000. As you can see, D is all the way up here on the left side of the graph, where it seems to be a lot more variable. The magnitudes of clutch per plate appearance, both on the positive and negative side, are pretty large. As you go farther to the right and increase the number of plate appearances though, you can see that it converges to near zero. Over a large sample, players' clutch values are settling closer and closer to zero. This means in general, players aren't consistently clutch year after year. This is a graph of defensive value over plate appearances. The top spots up here are held by Ozzie Smith, Yadier Molina, Pudge Rodriguez, and Cal Ripken Jr., all players who were great defenders. Over time, they separated themselves far and away from the average. You can see the upward trend. As they play more, good defenders accrue more defensive value. On the other side, the worst defenders are Gary Sheffield, Manny Ramirez, Frank Thomas, and Adam Dunn. 4 players that played a lot but were awful defenders. Over time, they got more negative. If that was the case with Clutch, this graph that we looked at earlier would have had a completely different distribution. In the Clutch case, there's no real trend as the variability stays roughly constant as the plate appearances go up. Unlike on defense where there are a ton of consistently great defenders and consistently awful ones that separate themselves over time, there isn't the same pattern with Clutch. Players just aren't consistently clutch in general. But is there an exception? Is there a hitter that doesn't converge to zero? Now let's expand this plot from earlier to include all seasons since 1970. The clutchest player on a per plate appearance basis is Jose Lind. Who, you might be asking? Yeah, I had never heard of him either. He played 9 seasons for the Pirates and Royals and had a career WRC plus of 68, which means he was not that good. The least clutch hitter on a per plate appearance basis is none other than Aaron Judge, who's right here. This has been a huge criticism of Judge's game, pretty much the only criticism you can give him when it comes to the offensive side of the game. But from what we know about this stat, most likely Lind and Judge wouldn't or won't sustain this over a larger sample. To pick the truly most clutch hitter of all time, I want a balance of a high clutch per plate appearance value while also maintaining it over a larger sample. Taking these 3 factors into account, the one that I want to pick out is here. This player is the all-time leader in pure clutch. He's number 18 in clutch per plate appearance despite having over 10,000 plate appearances in his career. He's the only player in the top 38 of this stat that has over 10,000 plate appearances. He's also just one of the best pure hitters of all time. It is the legendary Tony Gwynn. Yes, Tony Gwynn is statistically, in my eyes, the clutch king. And with the way he played the game, this makes sense. He was able to adjust his approach depending on what the situation asked for. Strikeouts are killers in terms of high leverage situations, which is something that Gwynn rarely did at 4.2%. Hitters who are more power-oriented that strike out a lot more are prone to inconsistent stretches, especially in smaller samples like high leverage at-bats. Gwynn was great in high leverage all throughout his career. Most of his numbers in high leverage situations were better than his career averages. The one thing that we miss out on Tony Gwynn is the playoff performance. Unfortunately, the Padres teams that he was on weren't that great, and he only made the postseason 3 times in his career. This is probably a huge reason why his name will never come up on one of those random lists that you find online. These lists tend to go strictly off narratives, which often have the postseason tied to them. Derek Jeter, David Ortiz, and Joe Carter certainly have had great postseason moments, but are we really going to crown the clutch king based off of a few moments? I'm not dismissing the pressure of the postseason, but it's very hard to evaluate a hitter's clutchness in the regular season, let alone the postseason, where the overall sample size is drastically smaller. They could have just had a lucky few at-bats. I'm not saying that is the case, but it's definitely a possibility. Plus, Gwynn really never got the chance to show what he could do in the crunch time of a postseason run, but based on what he did in his impressive career, I think we can assume what would have happened. Some other players that I considered were Ichiro Suzuki, who we talked about before, and he finishes right here. Omar Vizquel, Tim Raines, and Bobby Abreu were also close to Gwynn in terms of long-term clutch success. These players are the few where it seems like their clutch per plate appearance doesn't converge to zero in the long term. And as you can see, these are all contact-based hitters. This makes sense, as all the points that I said about Gwynn still stand. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we see players like Marcus Semien, Sammy Sosa, Giancarlo Stanton, Jim Thome, Andre Dawson, and Alex Rodriguez. These are all premier power hitters who go up to the plate looking to hit a home run pretty much every plate appearance. This strategy is good for overall success, but in terms of situational hitting and being clutch over a large sample, it's not ideal. Since contact hitters tend to be more clutch, no other hitter in the history of the sport makes more sense than Tony Gwynn to be the clutch king. So we answered the question, but is that the correct answer? I'd argue there isn't a correct answer. While the term clutch does have a formal definition, a lot of people differ in their opinions on what being clutch truly means. Does it mean stepping up in the postseason a few times? Does it mean being a great situational hitter over your whole career? It's up for debate. There have been so many legends that have been given the title of clutchest hitter of all time, but what if it was someone that we never considered? That's the question that I think is more important, not arguing endlessly about who's the best all time, but giving credit where credit's due, adding players to the discussion that may have not been there before by using nothing but good old data. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It's completely free, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.